Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
2 months ago, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the email from my insurance provider, the one that politely informed me that the medication I have to take every single day to stay functional was going up in cost again. And while I could technically survive without it for a while, the reality is that without it, I become a completely different person, sluggish, foggy, and unable to think clearly enough to even get through a normal workday without feeling like I'm underwater. I had already been struggling to keep up with the copays, juggling bills in a way that made me feel like I was back in my early 20s, and so I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my parents, explained the situation, and asked if they could help me out just until I figured out a long-term solution. They listened, or at least they pretended to, and then my mom's voice softened into that tone she uses right before she says something she knows will hurt but wants to make sound like life advice. She told me that as much as they would love to help, they were in a tight spot financially, and they thought it was important for me to learn to handle these things on my own because you're independent, you've always been strong, and we don't want to enable you to rely on us. I didn't argue. I just thanked them, told them I understood, and hung up, feeling this strange mix of disappointment and that old, familiar understanding that somehow, when it comes to me, there's always a reason they can't step in. I didn't even have time to sit in that feeling for more than a few days before my phone started lighting up with notifications from my sister's Instagram. There she was boarding a plane, glass of champagne in hand, perfectly posed in a plush first-class seat with a little caption about, "Off to Europe for 3 weeks, can't wait to eat my weight in pasta." The hashtags told me more than the caption did, the names of luxury hotels, the mention of family treat, and the one that made my stomach drop, hashtag best parents ever. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. My parents had told me they couldn't help me afford something that literally keeps me functioning, but they could buy my sister a 3-week luxury vacation across the Atlantic. And just in case I had any doubts, my aunt commented on one of her photos saying she hoped she was enjoying the gift and to thank mom and dad for making it happen. That's when the disappointment twisted into something else entirely, not just anger, but the sharp, cold realization that this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about priorities, and mine had never been at the top of their list. I didn't text them. I didn't ask why. Because really, what was the point? I already knew what they would say if I brought it up. They'd spin some version of, "She needed this trip for her mental health," or "You're stronger, you can handle tough situations," or maybe even, "We already help you in other ways." It was a script they'd been reading from my whole life, and I'd memorized my lines, the ones where I just nod, say I understand, and quietly swallow the unfairness. But this time, I didn't feel like playing along. For the next week, I watched her post picture after picture, sunsets from hotel balconies, shopping bags from designer stores, tickets to shows and museums. Each post was like a little reminder that my parents had looked at both of us, weighed our needs, and decided hers were worth thousands of dollars and mine weren't worth a cent. I thought about the nights I'd skipped going out with friends because I was too worried about making rent and covering my prescriptions, about the hours I'd spent on hold with insurance trying to fight for a lower price, about the fact that they had the means to make that stress disappear and simply chose not to. Something shifted for me in those weeks. It wasn't that I suddenly decided to cut them off completely, it was more that I finally let myself admit that the relationship was already broken, just in a way I had been too stubborn to acknowledge before. And once you admit something like that to yourself, you start seeing the cracks everywhere, and you start realizing how many times you've tried to glue them back together just so it could look like a family again, even though it never really was. When my parents finally called me, a week after my sister got home, I didn't answer. The voicemail was cheerful, casual. They wanted to plan holiday dinners and said they hoped I'd be there. I listened to it twice, not because I was thinking about going, but because I was trying to figure out if they really believed I would say yes after what they'd done. And that was when I decided I wasn't just going to skip the holidays. I was going to make sure that, by the time they realized I wasn't showing up anymore, it would be too late for them to do anything about it. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing for sure. This time, I wasn't going to swallow it and move on. This time, I was going to make them feel the same kind of dismissal they'd handed me, only mine would be quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. When I finally let myself look backward without editing the memories to make everyone else more comfortable, what came up wasn't one loud incident that explained everything, but a long string of small decisions and quiet comments that, when lined up, spelled the same word over and over. Because there was the time in college when my dad, whose name is Mark and who loves to introduce himself as a practical man who believes in fairness, told me that covering my last semester's gap would cheat me out of learning to solve my own problems, while in the same month my mom, Ellen, bragged at a barbecue about how proud she was to send my younger sister, Sophie, on a spring break trip because she deserved a reward for keeping her GPA up. And when I pointed out the contrast, it became my fault for putting a price tag on love. And then there was the first car after graduation that I bought used with a loan I took at a miserable interest rate, and I remember sitting next to Sophie when she came home from the dealership in a shiny compact sedan with a bow on it that our parents called a family safety gift, which sounded almost noble if you ignored that I had just written a check for a repair on my clunker that wiped my savings. And somehow I was still expected to be genuinely happy for her without noticing that the rulebook changed every time it was my turn. It's almost funny, in a warped way, how the language people use becomes a kind of wallpaper that, after enough years, you stop seeing, because I can still hear my mother's favorite line, the one about how I'm so capable and so resilient, which is a nice compliment on paper until you realize it was a permission slip for them to reroute support anywhere but in my direction, and the moments that should have been shared became tests of character that only I was ever required to pass, and I kept passing them, not because I enjoyed being the responsible one or because I thought it made me morally superior, but because I assumed that doing the right thing would eventually mean winning a level of respect that felt like love. And then the years stacked up, and the only thing that grew was my ability to swallow bitterness without making a face. I remember one holiday with the kind of clarity that doesn't fade, the one where my parents threw a big family dinner and toasted Sophie's engagement to a man named Ryan. And while everyone clinked glasses, my mother pulled me aside to whisper that the venue had requested an extra deposit earlier than expected, and she was sure I would not mind covering it just for a week or two because I am so good at managing money. And I said yes because I had the money and because saying no would have made me the villain in a story where my sister was the bride and the rest of us were supposed to orbit her like dutiful satellites. And then, months later, while I waited in a parking lot to get a prescription filled, Sophie sent me a cheerful text with a photo of the custom favors they had ordered, thanking Mom and Dad for paying for the fun extras, and I looked at that photo and knew that my loan had never been repaid and never would be, not because anyone was broke, but because everyone had decided my contribution did not count as a sacrifice, only as evidence that I could always be asked for more. Names matter to me here because I want you to understand that these aren't vague roles in a story. They're people with voices I can hear even when the phone is silent. And when Sophie joked at Thanksgiving that I'm the strong sister who doesn't need the spotlight, the table laughed, and my father told everyone how I once fixed the rental contract for the family reunion house after a mistake with the dates, and he said it like a charming anecdote about the capable older daughter, and I smiled and poured refills because it was easier than saying that I had also paid the penalty to secure the correct week and never asked to be reimbursed, not because I wanted to be a martyr, but because the fight that would have followed was always more costly than the money. So when the medication call happened and the Europe trip followed, what broke in me wasn't just trust in their priorities, it was my own habit of protecting their image by rounding off the corners so no one else noticed the cuts. And I realized that a big part of why they never felt the weight of what they did was because I had always carried it for them, and if I wanted anything to change, I had to stop being the padded wall they bounced against without pain, and that decision, as small as it sounds, became my first act of revenge, not loud and not messy, but surgical and clean in a way that felt truer to me than a screaming match ever could. I started with something simple and factual, because facts, when spoken calmly, do more damage to a carefully curated narrative than any rant ever will, and when my Aunt Joanne, the same one who had commented on Sophie's trip photos. Called to ask if I was excited for the holidays and whether I would bring my famous sweet potato casserole. I told her in a steady voice that I wouldn't be at the holidays this year, and when she asked why, with genuine concern and not malice, I said that I was taking care of my health and rethinking where I spend my energy, and when she probed a little more I added, just once and without bitterness, that my parents had told me they could not help me with the medication cost because they were tight on funds. And in the same week they surprised Sophie with a first-class trip across the ocean, and then I stopped talking and let the silence do the work, because gossip moves fast in families, but truth moves faster when it's simply laid on the table. Without spin. I did not post anything online, I did not send a mass message, and I did not ask anyone to take my side, but I answered questions directly when they were asked. And when my cousin emailed a group thread about coordinating the annual family rental that I usually booked, I replied all with a short, clear note that said I would not be organizing or subsidizing the house this year due to medical expenses and a need to focus on myself, and that anyone enthusiastic about the tradition should feel free to take the lead. And then I logged off and made dinner, and by the next afternoon my phone was full of polite check-ins and not so polite subtexts, because the minute people learned I had been the one quietly covering deposits and solving problems, the shine came off the story where my parents were the generous pillars, and I did not have to lift another finger to make that happen. That was the measurement of revenge I could live with right then, a clean cut that exposed the wiring without setting the house on fire, and as I watched the replies stack up and saw my mother's name pop into my inbox with a subject line that only said my name, I felt something steady inside me for the first time in a long while, because if they were going to finally feel the consequences of their choices, it would be through the simple experience of being seen, and I was the one who had chosen to turn on the light, which is why, when I clicked open her email and read the first line that accused me of humiliating them, I closed the laptop without answering, knowing that the next words I chose would decide everything that came after. When I finally picked up the phone and called my parents, I did it on a weekday evening when I knew they would both be home and too tired to pretend they were in a rush, and I told myself I would not raise my voice, I would not build a case like a prosecutor, and I would not ask for anything at all, because the minute you ask for something in this family you become the problem. So instead I started with a simple statement that even they could not spin, which was that I had heard them when they said they could not help. I had seen the way they celebrated sending Sophie on that luxury trip, and I wanted them to understand that I would not be attending holidays or playing support staff anymore, not out of spite, but because I was done volunteering for a role that came with obligations for me and indulgences for everyone else. My mother went quiet for a moment, and then she shifted into that voice she reserves for conversations she plans to win by wearing me down, the one that sounds like concern on the surface and control underneath, and she told me I was being dramatic, that I had always been independent, that they did not want me to build resentment by keeping score, and that the Europe trip was a unique situation because Sophie had been under stress and needed a reset, and, while she spoke, my father stepped in to add a practical flourish about airline miles and timing and how sometimes opportunities line up, and the whole thing was so familiar that I could almost recite it with them. Right down to the part where I was supposed to say I understood, because I am reasonable and mature, and not like other people who make everything about money. I let them finish, and then I said that if it were really about miles and timing, they could have said so the week I called about my medication instead of talking to me like I was a teenager trying to borrow gas money, and I told them I was not keeping score. I was keeping records, which is what adults do when they have repeatedly covered deposits, penalties, and last-minute emergencies that magically turn into gifts once I pay for them, and I said it without heat because the calmness mattered more than any big speech, and then I stopped, and the silence on their end felt like a glass wall finally cracking. Sophie must have been on speaker, or my mother looped her in, because her voice cut in bright and careless, and she said I should just get better insurance, because everyone knows there are ways if you really try, and she tossed in a joke about starting a GoFundMe for my mood pills, which I assume she thought was charming in a blunt little sister way, but it landed like a slap because it told me exactly how seriously my health ranked in her mind, and before I could respond, my father told her to hush and then told me I was taking an ugly tone, which made me laugh, not because anything was funny, but because of the absurdity of being accused of ugliness for saying the plain truth. So I took the moment I had planned for, the one that would make the rest of the conversation irrelevant, and I said that I was updating my life paperwork and wanted them to hear it from me first, that I had removed both of them as my emergency contacts and replaced them with my friend Lisa, that my medical proxy no longer listed either of their names because I needed someone who would treat my health as essential instead of optional, and that from this day forward any commitments made in my name for family events or reunions would be considered invalid unless they included my written confirmation, and I said it like a policy announcement because that is what it was, not a threat, not a plea, not a performance. Just the new reality that came from a simple observation. If I am supposed to be independent, then I will be fully independent, and that means I am not their safety net either. My mother gasped like I had thrown a chair, and my father tried to pivot into logistics, asking if I was sure I wanted to do something so permanent, reminding me that families are messy, but they stick together. And I told him that sticking together is not the same thing as sticking me with the bill, and that permanence is exactly what I wanted because moving the boundary line every time they felt like crossing it had turned me into a doormat with a calendar. And I was done. Then, because I could feel the conversation trying to slip back into bargaining, the what if we help a little, and the maybe you misread the situation routine, I delivered the first quiet blow that would land beyond that phone call. And I told them I would be sending an email that evening with an itemized list of past expenses I had covered for family emergencies, marked paid in full by me and forgiven, not because I expected repayment, but because I was closing the account. And that way, there would never again be confusion about who had carried what, and if they ever tried to complain to aunts or cousins about me abandoning traditions, I would simply forward the same sheet with a kind note that the ledger was closed and my participation going forward would be by invitation and mutual respect, not obligation and assumption. There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear the soft sounds of people recalculating, and then my mother said I was humiliating them, and I told her I had no interest in humiliating anyone. I was only interested in telling the truth without covering it in pretty language, and that if the truth embarrassed them, that was not a problem I could solve anymore, and that was when I ended the call, not with a slam, not with tears, just with a steady goodbye that felt like putting down a heavy box I should never have been carrying alone. An hour later I sent the email to them, copied only to myself, with the subject line, closed accounts, and it contained calm bullet points that named the wedding deposit, the reunion penalties, the rental corrections, and the holiday extras I had handled. Each stamped with a big simple sentence at the top that said zero due because I was not chasing money, I was erasing excuses, and in the last line I wrote that I wished them well on whatever traditions they chose to continue without me this year, and I meant it, because my revenge at that moment was not about setting fires, it was about shutting valves, and when, just before midnight, my cousin forwarded me a message from my mother bragging in the family chat that the summer house was already secured because she always takes care of it. I smiled in a way I had not smiled in years, because I knew exactly how quietly and completely that assumption was about to collapse, and I would not have to raise my voice to make it happen. After I sent the closed accounts email and turned my phone face down, I decided I would run my life like a clean ledger with firm lines and no unexplained debits, which meant that when the family group chat started bubbling about birthdays and holiday flights and the reunion week at the rental everyone treats like an inherited right, I did not jump in to correct dates or call the owner to rescue their mistakes. And instead, I watched in a detached way as my mother announced, with the confidence of someone who believes history will always repeat because it always has, that the house was already secured and everyone should send their shares to her when convenient, and I did not respond because I had already said, in clear words, that I was not organizing or subsidizing anything this year, and it is not my job to translate simple sentences into the language of people who benefit from pretending not to understand. What made the next part almost too easy was that I know the mechanics better than anyone else, because for years I have been the one who negotiated the rate, who paid the penalties when a cousin changed jobs and shifted dates, who smoothed over that 1 year when a storm knocked out half the power and everyone wanted a refund while still using the house, and the owner, a direct and fair woman named Carla who runs a tight operation. Trusts me because I never promised what I could not deliver, and I always documented everything in writing, so when I called her and said I would not be renting this year and that any inquiries from my family should be treated as a new booking request without my name, she thanked me for the heads up, confirmed that the week was presently open, and mentioned that demand had been strong and she was holding dates lightly for another group who were ready to pay in full by the following Monday, and I said that was fine, because boundaries are not real if you keep making exceptions to protect people from the consequences of ignoring them. Over the next few days I stayed quiet and took care of my actual life, which included meeting with HR to finalize my updated emergency contacts, finishing paperwork for a patient assistance program my doctor helped me access. Something I would have done sooner if I had not wasted so much time trying to be loyal to a fantasy of family and helping my friend Lisa move a couch. And while I did these normal things, I watched my mother's certainty harden into brittle bragging, because she doubled down in the chat by telling an aunt that I had already used my special rate, which was a neat bit of fiction since the special rate was not a coupon but a relationship with a person who knew I paid on time and kept my word. And as I read that line, I realized how much of my life has been spent lending my name to keep other people comfortable. The first crack appeared when my cousin Tyler, who handles money like a person who thinks Venmo is a savings account, asked for the contract so his partner could get the time off approved, and my mother replied that the contract was in process and that I had taken care of it like always, and I let that sit for a full day, not out of pettiness, but to give her every possible opportunity to correct herself without my intervention, and when she did not, I wrote a short, calm message to the thread that said I had not booked the house, that I would not be booking the house, and that anyone who wanted to rent it should contact the owner directly with the understanding that the usual discount and flexibility no longer applied because my name and credit card would not be involved. And then I muted the chat, made dinner, and let grown adults do what grown adults do when the invisible labor they rely on stops being invisible. By the next afternoon my phone was buzzing again, not with apologies, but with a familiar mix of scolding and panic, because my mother called 3 times in a row, my father texted a paragraph about tradition and family memories, and Sophie sent a breezy note that began with a heart and ended with a demand, on the theory that fake sweetness works like grease on a stuck door, and when none of that got a response, I received a terse email from my mother asking me to forward the contract, like usual, at which point I replied with one sentence that said there was no contract and that Carla was free to rent to whomever she wished, and I added a second sentence that repeated, for clarity, that this update had been publicly shared in the group weeks ago, which meant any confusion now was the result of people choosing not to read. In the background, Carla did what good owners do when a year's worth of assumptions crash into the reality of a calendar. Because she sent a polite notice to the generic family email we had used in past years stating that the week remained unbooked and that due to high demand she would release the soft hold by Monday morning if no payment arrived. And within an hour my father forwarded that notice to the entire group with a thin layer of accusation aimed in my direction, and I did not rise to it, because you do not negotiate with people who are still arguing with facts. You let the facts do their slow, clean work, and that evening, when my mother finally wrote a quieter message asking me to step in just this once, because people had already arranged childcare and flights, I sent her a screenshot of my earlier note and told her I hoped they could work something out directly. And then I put my phone away and took a long breath that did not feel like victory so much as oxygen after a crowded room. The small revenge I wanted at that moment was not chaos, but accountability, so I waited until the last morning of Carla's deadline and then, because I believe in fairness even with people who do not show it to me, I sent my parents a final clear email that said the full price total was listed in Carla's invoice, that the rate I used to negotiate had never been theirs to claim, and that if they paid by noon they could still secure the week without involving me at all. And I copied no one and Used no sharp words, and then I went for a walk and turned my phone to silent, because whether they met that deadline or not was finally their responsibility rather than mine. And any embarrassment that followed would be the direct outcome of their own certainty colliding with the reality I had told them about in plain English. At 11:48, my inbox pinged with a forwarded message from Carla thanking the other party for full payment and confirming their booking, which told me my parents had missed the window they assumed they owned. And at 11:52, my mother called and left a voicemail that began with a shaky accusation about betrayal and ended with a plea to help salvage the situation, and I listened to the whole thing once, then again. And I felt the clean satisfaction of a boundary holding without me having to hold it with both hands, and I knew, as I deleted the voicemail and opened a blank email, that I was ready to make the move I had saved for the day that mattered most to them. The move that would not simply expose the old story, but replace it with a new one where I did not owe them my time, my money, or my silence. And as I began to type the subject line, I realized that this final step would be the only explanation I would ever need again. I had been carrying this final card in my pocket for months, not because I was unsure about playing it, but because timing matters more than force when it comes to ending a pattern that has lasted for decades. And the truth is that I wanted the fallout to land exactly when they were at their most certain that I would eventually cave, when they were telling other people with casual confidence that, yes, I had been difficult lately, yes, I had said some harsh things, but when the holidays came, I would be there. Because I always was, and that was the part they believed was unshakable, that no matter how many times they ignored my needs, bent the truth, or outright took advantage, I would still appear in the doorway, casserole in hand, smiling for the sake of keeping the peace. I had heard the echoes of that assumption in phone calls relayed through relatives, in little comments on social media, in the way Sophie posted a group photo from last year with the caption, "Can't wait for the next one," tagging me without even asking if I planned to come. They all spoke and acted like my attendance was a natural law, as fixed as the dates on the calendar, and I knew that letting that belief stand was the last piece of leverage I needed to dismantle the whole structure they had built on my reliability. The move itself was simple in design but deliberate in execution, because for years, I had been the quiet architect of the holiday gatherings, the one who booked the spaces, coordinated the menus, sent the reminders, and made sure the day actually happened, even if someone else took the credit when relatives arrived and everything looked seamless. Most of them didn't even know how much of it I handled. They thought my parents were the organizers because they were the ones handing out drinks at the door and making toasts. I let that illusion stand for a long time, partly because it was easier than explaining, partly because I thought the point was to keep the event alive, and partly because I assumed that, eventually, someone would see the pattern and acknowledge it without me having to ask. Of course, that acknowledgement never came. So this year, when my parents started their usual round of messages about who was bringing what and what time people should arrive, I quietly did something I had never done before. I booked a different event entirely, for the same day, with the people who had shown me genuine reciprocity over the past few years. People who had been there when I needed help without turning it into a transaction or a lecture. It wasn't some dramatic public announcement. I didn't post a photo of myself with a bold caption or send out a group-wide message shaming anyone. I simply replied to my parents' invitation with a short, calm note. I won't be attending this year. I have other plans. No explanation, no apology, no defensive wall of words. I knew they would read it over and over, trying to find the crack that would let them wedge in guilt or obligation, and I knew they would tell each other and anyone who would listen that I was being petty or selfish. But the brilliance of it was that there was nothing to argue with. I have other plans is a closed door that doesn't slam, it just doesn't open. The real sting for them wasn't just that I wasn't coming, it was that I didn't try to reschedule my absence to make it easier on them. And I didn't leave them enough time to scramble and make new arrangements without admitting to the rest of the family that I wasn't going to be there. I could picture the conversation in their kitchen when they realized that, without me, the food they had counted on someone else preparing, the seating arrangements I had quietly managed, and the timing I had always kept on track were now problems they would have to solve themselves. For the first time, they would have to carry the weight they had spent years pretending didn't exist, the weight I had been carrying for them while they told everyone how much they did for me and Sophie. On the day of the holiday, while they were no doubt fielding questions from relatives about why I wasn't there, I was sitting at a long table in a friend's dining room, surrounded by people who looked me in the eye when I spoke and listened without already deciding what my role should be in their story. The air felt different, not because the conversation was free of conflict. Families, chosen or otherwise, always have their quirks and disagreements, but because there was no ledger being quietly tallied in the background. I was there because I wanted to be, and the people around me were there because they wanted me there, not because I was useful, not because I could be leaned on without thanks, and not because showing up would keep them from looking bad. Later that night, after the dishes were done and I was back home, I saw that I had 12 missed calls and 6 voicemails from my mother, 2 from my father, and a few terse texts from Sophie, all carrying some version of the same message: "We can't believe you did this." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the reflex to explain or defend myself. They were shocked, genuinely shocked, because they had built their entire understanding of me on the belief that no matter what they did, I would keep choosing them over myself. In one quiet, clean decision, I had shown them that belief was wrong. I didn't answer that night, and I didn't answer the next day, because the point had been made, and it didn't need to be underlined. The beauty of it, and the reason it worked, was that my absence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. They could spin stories about me being ungrateful or cold, but none of those stories could change the fact that, when the moment came, I simply wasn't there. And that was the move that ended the game, not with a fight, but with the kind of silence that leaves the other side scrambling to fill it, knowing they can't.